and welcome to this video. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about basically a primer slash introduction to scales. So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to make this a 5-part video. It's basically going to try to wrap my head around everything I know about scales and put it out there. People can get better at the game. So the first part, which will be today's part, will be I will talk about the card. I think in order to be a good Magic player, and I guess the first step to being a good Magic player is to understand the reason why you have a card in your deck. I think too many times I see people not really understanding the roles of cards in your deck, and it's kind of baseline, but if you don't do this, it's almost impossible to become better because you just don't understand why things are working, why things are not working. The second one will be, we'll talking, and I think this should be from now on a standard in the industry if you ask me. I will be talking mulligan decisions. It's extremely important with almost any deck right now, especially with London Mulligan, and I'm going to be talking through the first 3 turns of the game. So how you, the relationship between your opening turns and your mulligan decisions is super key, especially in your unsideboarded games, but also post-sideboard as well, but I'll dedicate that to another part. Part 3, we will be mid-game kills. I'll start talking about how you can set up a turn 4, 5, 6 kill, so right after the early game. So how can you set up a kill by interaction, despite your opponent attacking you, and despite of all those things, how can you maximize the amount of counters so you can get those kills? Mid-game, which I think is probably one of the places where skills is most known for, and probably one of the most powerful moments for you, is around the turn 4 to 6. When you already have had time to deploy, you can play 2 drops a turn, you can have a spare mana for turbos or whatever. This is where skills, I think, really shines. Now I'll talk about endgame strategies, so how to set up for the endgame. Not every time is possible to kill your opponent in 5 and 6. You need to plan for a longer game. How do you do that without being blown out? And how do you set up like the different pieces that your skills deck have in order to be able to actually outgrind your opponent, or set up a situation where you can win in spite of a heavy interaction from your opponent in the endgame, where mana becomes not a problem. I think that's how I define the endgame. It's like when you already have enough mana to cast all your spells, and cards are becoming the most important resource, but yet you still want to kill your opponent because you're not the kind of deck that just wins by any other thing than killing your opponent. And finally, I'm going to be talking about sideboarding. I talked about briefly before about this. I made a sideboard card. I probably will update it now in because I will not find in a house. And then I'm going to talk about sideboarded games. There's try to talk what is different about what I've talked before in sideboarded games. What changes in your mulligans, what changes in mid-game, what changes in... So without further ado, let's get into the card. Alright, so here we have all the cards that you could be possibly wanting to play in your scales deck. This is not a deck list, this has 6 cards. And only 2 off sideboard because I have like only singletons. So I will try to talk about every single card from basically from the mana until the end, right? So let's talk. Okay, so this is a mono green deck. Of course you can splash for colors, but that is more advanced. And I'm guessing if you're watching this video, you're not interested in the super advanced stuff. You're more interested in learning the basics of the. So this is a mono green deck. So the mana base, what it's trying to accomplish first and foremost, is to be able to play Hardened Scales and turn 1. So to that effect, you need to play forests. Right? Forests are probably one of the better lands in the game, believe it or not. No downside, and they allow you to play the Hardened Scales on turn 1. This is very important. You need to play a certain amount of forest. It's uncertain if you want to play something between 6 and 9, 10. It should be probably the top level of how many forests you want to play. Because since you're mostly a colorless deck, you want most of your lands to do something other than just produce mana. And therefore take advantage of this colorless status that you. But nevertheless, you want to play at least a certain amount of forest to be able to cast these Hardened Scales, cast these Ancient Streams, and cast some of your sideboard cards. That is the most basic of your mana base stuff. Don't cut on the forest. Don't go to 3 forests or something ridiculous like this. Even though you may think, oh man, it's okay if I don't cast skills turn 1. It's very important. Then we go to other utility lands. Darkstone Citadel is used to be one of the biggest staples on the deck when Mox Opal was not planned. This allowed you to your metal craft early. Now this has a bit of its lost, but still is a very good fuel to Iron Ravager. So it's a card you can consider. Especially good when you want to have explosive starts, when the metagame is very hostile to going past turn 5, Nexus Citadel is there for you, because you can sacrifice it to allow for faster turn, like more common turn 3 kills and faster turn 4 kills than you would normally do, right? Because anytime you can basically allows you to put a counter on Rodger for basically just playing a land. So quite a good card, mostly done when you mostly use when cards are not so important, but you only want is time. So you want to really grind, not grind. You really want to just kill your opponent as quickly as possible. That's the is there for you. The other card that is very important in Hardened Scales is Inmoth Nexus. Inmoth Nexus is a 4-off in every single Hardened Scales that you should never, almost ever cut this card. This allows us there's 3 ways to win with scales, and this is one of them. Just putting 9 counters on Inmoth Nexus and attacking, or putting 4 counters and attacking twice, putting 2 counters and attacking 4 times, whatever. Inmoth Nexus is basically, it's like a creature, is a flying creature that has double strike, and it has basically poison, right? For those of you who don't know how poison works, if you give 10 poison counters to your opponent, they lose the game, no matter how much life they have. So it's an out to a lot of Helio decks, it's an out to an infinite combo deck, and it's since it's flying, it's very easy way to just set up the quickest kill possible almost with the deck is with Inmoth Nexus. So don't sleep on this card. This card is extremely strong, and you should not play it out maybe super early in the game unless you plan on activating it the turn after, because it's a prime target for land destruction. So Field of Ruins, Ghost Quarters, Assassin's Trophies, they often will target Inmoth Nexus just because it's that powerful. Yeah. Inmoth Nexus is an extremely important card, one of the pillars of the deck, basically. I think if this card didn't exist, the deck would be probably pretty, honestly. So this is how important Inmoth Nexus is. Of course, it's not the most common. Another card that is extremely important in the deck is the Nano Reborn. Nano Reborn looks like weak when you look at it for the first time. But the more you play it and the more you understand it, this card does it all. So first it's a tabland that produces green, good for main goal on the mana base, which is to cast Hardened Scales. Doesn't cast it turn 1, just cast it turn 2. Better than nothing. And it always will tap for green from that point on. And it also enters the battlefield with a 1/1/1 counter on. That has multiple uses. The most normal use is that when a creature enters the battlefield, then you can move that counter into that creature. That's like number 1 uses. Let's say you play Nano Reborn tap game turn 1, turn 2 you play a Ballista, you put a counter on it, and it basically has that as a smaller Hardened Scales, a one-shot Hardened Scales. Then you have a 2/2 Ballista that can shoot down, for example, a Birds of Paradise. Pretty strong. Secondary effect of this is you can actually trigger animation module when the Nano Reborn enters the battlefield without casting a spell. So you can play Nano Reborn and they will trigger animation module because it's a permanent that has a +1/+1 counter on. Then you can make a servo basically without spending any cards, which is kind of nice. The third usage of this is an endgame situation when you can actually proliferate Nano Reborn to allow you to make more servos. This is I will cover more in the later parts. So basically, Nano Reborn is very flexible on what it does. It both gives you counters. It is much better top deck than a Forest later in the game. And the final usage of it is that it also triggers on your opponent's creatures entering the battlefield. So sometimes there will be players like Neoform players that will play a creature and they will try to do something to the creature, like sacrifice the creature, before you have time to respond. Nano Reborn gives you time to respond, and then it basically allows you to kill a creature when the graph trigger is on the stack. Don't miss this. It actually comes up more often than you think. It doesn't come up in most games, but when it does come up, you feel 15 ahead. Next, we have Pendelhaven. Pendelhaven is also a staple in the deck. It's basically a forest for most of the time, but because we play so many 1/1 type creatures, the target 1/1 creature gets +1/+2 is very relevant. It's extremely strong blocking, especially, but it's also great to Pendelhaven and Inmoth Nexus for an extra poison damage. Yeah, this card is really just great. It's free basically to play, and we just take a lot of advantage of it. I think we even take more advantage than elf decks nowadays because workers are 1/1s, even Rousers are 1/1s, Ballistas and Hangout Walkers are 1/1s when you just cast them without scales. All your servers are 1/1s, right? So we have a bunch of 1/1s a lot of times if you don't have skills out. So basically this can protect from Lava Dart. This can allow you to block a Goblin guy. This card has a lot of uses. You can also use it For example, if you're attacking with a 2/2 Hangable Walker and your opponent has a 1/1 that they're trying to block with, and you want your Hangable Walker to die, you can give it Pendle Haven to your opponent's 1/1 creature, so your Hangable Walker dies. This is kind of a million head play, but if you ever do this, you will basically win the moral battle, and that is all that matters in the end. Then Nexus score is another staple on the deck. It can go from 1 to 3, and I would say the most common right now is to play 2. The main usage of this is the land that produces mana, like most lands, which is great. And like a land that produces mana is already a good land. Like, that's why you put lands in your deck. But on top of that is a sack outlet, so it allows you to sacrifice a creature. And why do you want sack outlets? Well, a lot of our cards have Modeler or have like Hangable Walker. They die, they make Topters, so this allows you to sacrifice creatures in order to gain advantage. Not every time you have a Ravager, so you need to have these not as good sack outlets when those situations are raised that you do want the sacrifice without having to Rodger. This also works through a Stony Silence effects like Counter Recreator, like Collect the Roof. So this is actually a really powerful card. And it's kind of free to play. It's a call. It taps for colorless. Doesn't come in tap. So you can just use it whenever you need to. And a lot of times it will just be a land, but be careful not to tap this card too often. I do this a lot, but it's kind of one of the first lands I tap. This one should be one of the last lands you tap because it has such a utility, Like basically people, for example, can path your exile Hangable Walker and you can sacrifice it with, for example. So making your opponent think a lot. And a very easy card for your opponent to miss that has some utility into it. A lot of times people will forget. The Gain 1 life is nice. I mean, it has come up sometimes that you are very low in life. You basically get out of bold range versus a burn deck. Even though burn is not very popular right now. Then Northern Impediment is basically a forest that costs you some life. I've been moving away from Northern Impediment myself because so much stuff that Scales can do with the mana that I think Northern Impediment kind of fights a bit against the core principle of the deck, right? So one of the good things about Scales is that you can more or less utilize their mana efficiently throughout the game. Compared to other decks that are not very good at this. So Northern Impediment, even though it gives you an extra card that can use your mana, it also puts you 1 mana behind, and it taps 1 mana. So this card is only really good in like late stages of the game, when you have, let's say, 10 lands, and then yeah, you would not mind having an extra card in hand. But a lot of the times it's kind of over. You will never tap it, and then what happens is that if you, for some reason, draw like 2 or 3 or 2 of these, you're playing 2 of these, and you play them in. You draw. They are the only lines in your hand, and you play them. And since you're using your mana every turn for the first at least 3 or 4 turns or 5 turns, and hopefully for the rest of the game, you will like to lose ton of life. You'll maybe lose like 5, 6, 7, 8 life, and that will be just enough for a lot of aggressive decks to kill you. So I've been moving away from this card, but keep it in mind, it's especially good in situations where you actually need to kill your opponent fast. You need to find that Ravager, you need to find that one-off spell that can win the game. It works pretty well with Dazzle Citadel, but I wouldn't put it in a deck that is trying to grind for longer games or is trying to go for this turn 5-6 kills, because most of the time you will not have time to cash it in if you're trying to aim for those turn 5 to 6 kills, which is, I think, is the sweet spot for the deck. Trying to lean too early of a kill sends to too many mulligans, and trying to go much later sometimes can end up being that your opponent has answers for everything you could possibly do in a turn. Then we have 2 more lands here that are worth playing as Hardened Scales. The first one is Hardened Souls. Hardened Souls is basically a colorless land when it comes to casting stuff in our deck, right? So it doesn't cast Hardened Scales, so that's one of the reasons we don't play for them before. But it does allow us to make our constructs, which are most of our creatures, and our Ravager uncontrollable, which can come up. So as a one-off, I like this. I played 2, I played 3. It depends on how many counterspells you expect. For example, in my local meta, there's a ton of counterspells. People play counterspells like, like I would say around 1/3, a bit more maybe. 40% of the players almost play counterspells. People just love the counterspell meta. So counterspells are very good, especially because people don't play they play a lot of tap out draw go control. They really like this kind of long 70-minute games. Counterspell shines there. It doesn't shine so much versus decks that they're trying to kill you fast because it doesn't cast Hardened Scales, but it does shine versus, for example, Chalice of the Void decks, where it can allow you to cast a worker through a Chalice of the Void or a Ravager through a Chalice of the Void on 2. It also can help you cast, even though it doesn't tap for green for Scales, it does tap for green for Gem Razor, making you Gem Razor uncounterable. Pretty cool. I mean, if you don't own Hardened Scales and you're trying to build a deck for the first time, don't buy Hardened Scales. It's expensive and it's not that useful in the deck. But if you have the cash, or you have the ticks, or you just want to have it on your toolbox, I think if you own one, it's probably a good idea to put it sometime. And finally, the card that is sort of like Inmoth Nexus, is like the uncorrupted version of Inmoth Nexus, is Bling Nexus. It deals normal damage, so it allows you to attack your opponent for damage. And it also has the secondary ability that allows you to give +1/+1 to another Bling Moth creature, which can be Inmoth Nexus. Inmoth Nexus is a Bling Moth when you pay 1. So this allows you basically to pump Bling Moth Nexus in a similar way like Pendelhaven does, of course costing 2. It can also for example, pump itself when you're blocking. This is an interesting one. So you can just activate the Bling Moth Nexus block, and then pump itself because it can pay with its own hand. You can pay itself, right? So kind of nice for blocking 1/1s. Kind of nice to block in 2/2s and trading. Yeah, this card's pretty good. The main usage of this card is that when you have had a lot of counters in the battlefield and people wipe you, sometimes you will end up with a nozzle that has 20+ counters, and this Bling Moth Nexus is there great to be able to activate it. You get all those counters and you finish it. Right? So it just increases the threat density of the deck without costing you any. Because again, lands are lands. Lands are there to cast your spells, but in a land that can also win you the game, it's a pretty good deal. It is also secretly a Darksteel Citadel for 1. So you can actually pay 1 mana with Bling Moth Nexus and turn it into an artifact creature that can be sacrificed. So it's something you can keep in mind when you have a lot of lands. That's what I mean. The Nurturing Pillar is not so good, because you have so much utility in your lands and so much ability to utilize mana with your lands that this is great. I actually love this card. I've been liking it more and more the more I play it. Alright, so these are lands. I hope I have been able to. Alright, where was I? Welding Jar. Okay, Welding Jar has maybe lost a bit of its charm, the same way that Darksteel lost a bit of its charm when Mox Opal was banned. This card was used to generate some really obnoxious turns where you would go something like Darksteel Citadel, Welding Jar, Mox Opal. You have 2 mana, turn 1. You're welcome. That was cool. That was reminiscent of a different time in Magic. But now Welding Jar is basically only uses to protect your own creatures, which it had also back in the day, or artifacts. So you want to play anywhere probably between 0 and 2. I wouldn't go past 2. I think 2 is as many as you can possibly want to play. But Welding Jar has this nice thing that it still allows you to get sacrificed to get counters on your Ravager, and it protects your creatures. Important thing about Regenerate. Regenerate is a weird keyword that they actually got rid of. So what happens with Regenerate is then it basically puts like a layer of protection on top of the artifact. So when it gets destroyed, not exiled, not --, destroyed, it will, instead of destroying it, it will tap that artifact, right? So if you're attacking with lethal Inmoth Nexus and your opponent, I don't know, it just claims it, you can Welding Jar it, but it will tap the Inmoth Nexus and take it out of combat, so you will not deal the damage. Right? So it's not a way to protect your Alins so much. More like a way to protect basically to trade up in mana, because it costs 0 mana, right? So if your opponent uses, I don't know, a Maelstrom Pulse to kill your Copter or your Ballista, and then you use Welding Jar to negate it, you spend 0 mana, your opponent just spend 3, but you still kind of trade it even on cards. Decently powerful card, pretty good when Shadow decks are popular and Fatal Push decks are popular, because it's one of the better answers to like Fatal Push and Assassin's Trophy and everything. If people Assassin's Trophies your artifacts and you are able to Welding Jar it, you still look for the client. Okay, let's go on. Then we have a Hardened Scales. Hardened Scales is namesake of the deck, and basically how it works, I mean, it's deceptively simple. Whenever you have a creature enter the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it, it enters with an additional 1/1 counter on it. So that means that if you have a worker that is a 1/1, and you play Hardened Scales first, and then you play the worker, it will still be it will come into battlefield with a 2/2. And this thing scales the more scales you have. So instead of, if you have 2 scales, it will come in as a 3/3. You have 4, sorry, it will come in as a 4/4. If you have 4 scales, it will come in as a 5/5, right? So basically each instance of scales gives you an extra counter, which is really, really powerful, especially in combination with Arbon Ravager, right? And this also goes into anytime And actually, I kind of read this card wrong. Like, let me start again. So Hardened Scales, what it does is, if one counter will be put into the creature, so it also works when you modular. It also works when you sacrifice the Ravager. It also works when you proliferate. So basically, anytime that you would add a counter, you add an additional counter. So that means that, for example, with Ravager, the more you move the counters around, the more counters you will get. Then this is probably the most important card in the deck, and without this card, the deck wouldn't exist. It would be a bad deck, but important. So it's important to know how this card works in the sense that it does not put a counter when a creature enters the battlefield, or if a creature would have 0 counters, it doesn't give them an extra counter. So you cannot cast a Ballista for 0. Having enter a 1/1 counter, it will just die. So it only works when the creature will already get a counter. It doesn't work on your opponent's creature. So basically, yeah, what I'm trying to say is read the card. But it's very good. Then the Ozolith is a bit more complicated. So the addition to the Ozolith deck has made it a bit much different than it used to be. So the Ozolith gives us, it's not powerful in the same sense that Monk's Opal was. Monk's Opal was powerful in the explosive sense. The Ozolith is much more powerful in the resilience sense and in the basically turn 5, 6, 7 power that you can get out of it. It's not as good as a turn 1 play as, for example, Hardened Scales, but it's a very good turn 1 play. Much better, probably the second better turn 1 play that you have. How the Ozolith works is whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, so it can be bounced, can be exiled, can die, can sacrifice, whatever, you return to hand, doesn't matter, then the counters that this creature has will go into the Ozolith. +1 counters, -1 counters, or whatever. And then at the beginning of your combat step, you can put those counters in a creature you control. So basically, with the main usage of this is that if you have, for example, a Ballista that gets bolted, then you don't use the counters will go into the Ozolith, and then you can put it in the next combat step in another creature, basically keeping your counters alive. One of the things with Scales that it's a bit of the weakness is your opponent is able to constantly wipe your creatures, and you're not able to have a board presence. It's very hard to win because it's the synergy between the different creatures that makes the deck. It's not so much one individual creature that works, but it's more like when you have had a critical mass of counters, then it's very, very hard for your opponent to do about that. So the Ozolith helps a lot in this regard. What the Ozolith can also be used for is doubling the counters. For example, let's say you have a worker and you find a way to sacrifice it. You'll model it into a creature, and you will put a counter on the Ozolith at the same time. Because the modeler doesn't move the counters. What modeler does is puts the same amount of counters that the creature originally had into a new creature. But the Ozolith moves the counter into the Ozolith, right? And then you can move those counters from the Ozolith into that creature, effectively doubling the counters that you have, right? This is extremely, of course, popular. Works really well with Hardened Scales. Together is an extremely strong combination. But it's basically, in that sense, it's more or less like a Hardened Scales in the sense that it will eventually double your counter if you choose to model, and on top of that, you the counters with the Ozolith. This is a work used a lot with Iron Ravager. So say you can sag your board to Iron Ravager, make a, for example, 10/10 Iron Ravager. You sacrifice the Ravager to itself, put the counters on, for example, a Ballista, and then 10 counters on the Ozolith that then you can put on top of the Ballista as well, allowing you to basically have that for plus count. Really powerful stuff, really synergistic with the deck. This card is a godsend from Ikoria. I did not expect they would print something like this, and they printed, and I'm super pumped. Almond Worker, secretly one of the better cards in the deck. This is the most efficient counter producing card in the deck, and this is something that I've overlooked many times, but I think it is now not overlooked by me anymore. So this card is the most simple smaller creature, 1 counter for 1 mana. But what happens if you have Hardened Scales? This is 2 counters for 1 mana, which is an extremely good rate, like better than any other card. And if you have, let's say, Ozolith and Almond Worker, it's 2 counters from the worker plus 1 for the and basically what the worker will do is it will move up to 5 counters when you without the Ozolith. If you have a Hardened Scales and a worker, you play the worker and then sacrifice the worker to put it into another creature, you will end up with 5 additional counters on that creature if you have the Ozolith. Kind of bits that is super bad, but you get what I mean, right? Worker, the most efficient creature that puts counters on things. It's great because people don't want to use removal on it, so it's also pretty good beat down plan against control. Just play a lot of workers, attack them with it, and force them to use removal on the workers instead of using removal on a Ravager or Ballista that probably would use. Also allows for the fastest skills because it allows you to put a ton of counters on the Ravager, and overall it's a fantastic card. You know, and the flavor is pretty cool. The bars are as strong as the whole. Kind of like very cool with the rest of this. Then we have a card called Animation Module. This is one of the most key cards for the late game strategy of Scales, but basically it allows you to turn any spare mana that you have in colorless servos, on one colorless servo. So you can pay 1 mana anytime you have a counter, put into a permanent you control, and you make a servo. That allows you to basically keep making servos and keep using your mana as long as you have some way to move the counters around. Like for example, it triggers twice if, for example, a worker dies and you have an Ozolith. Because you have 1 counter put into a creature with a modular and 1 counter put into the Ozolith, that will be 2 triggers, right? So you can make 2 servos, and then when you move the counter from the Ozolith, you have another trigger. So generally, we have more triggers than mana we have to spend in on, but this is just a card that allows us to always spend our mana and make this army of servos that is hard to deal with for your opponent. There's a lot of fodder for sacrifice for Ravager and for other cards. And on top of that, you can pay 3 mana and tap the animation module to give an extra counter to one of your permanents, for example, Nano Reborn, or Ballista, or Hangable Walker, or Ravager, but also you can give it to your opponent. And which kind of counter you want to give to your opponent? Poison counters. So this is an alternative way of winning with this deck. You can give 1 poison counter to your opponent early on in the game, for example, versus a tap draw kind of deck. And then from there on, you spend 3 mana every turn just giving them an extra counter with the animation model until they're dead 9 turns later. That is sometimes not the best line, but what you can do, sometimes you will get to 8 poison counters with the attacks, and then they will find a way to do with the emote, and then you can give them the final 2 poisons with animation model. Don't forget, this is one of the strongest late game engines that we have, and it's also a really great way to not spend our mana in our turn, so we spend the mana on our opponent's turn. For example, proliferating one of our creatures and making an extra servo, making it so opponent's counter spells are useless at that point. Very strong card. You can play anywhere from 1 to 4. So yeah, I would say you never should leave your house with less than 2, most likely. I played 3 recently. I'm kind of leaning around 2, because drawing 2 is kind of this affects the stack. So if you put 1 counter and you have 2 animation models, you do make 2 servos. But we put so many counters that a lot of times it's just not that good. Like honestly, it just loses a bit of its loss when you have 2 or 3 copies of it. So that's why 2 is a good number to have. Reduces the chances of drawing multiples, but it still gives you a decent chance of drawing it compared to only playing. Interesting things. This card people wanted to get banned a few years ago, a couple of years ago. When I started playing, everybody was like, "Oh, ban Interesting Things, too good." Nowadays, Modern is in a situation where cantrips are not that good. You actually would much rather have a card that gives you card advantage. Now, it doesn't matter what card it is, because you can just fill up your deck with such value cards that it doesn't matter. You just want any card, you know. So you would rather have a card that, for example, draws you an extra card, even though it's not that strong, rather than a card that lets you dig deeper. Ancient Strings does that. Ancient Strings allows you to find a colorless permanent and put it into your hand. That's basically all your lands and every permanent in your deck except Hardened Scales. So basically, Ancient Strings allows you to look at the 5 cards and choose the best one on the top. Really strong. You can play anywhere from 0, which is weird, to 4. Ancient Strings. The more Ancient Strings you play, normally you need less lands because you can Ancient Strings on the early turns to get a land. But that's not a really greening strategy recently, so it's much better to have the lands already. For example, playing somewhere more than 22, maybe 23, maybe 24 lands. Have those lands already. And then just using Ancient Strings as a cantrip to find a threat later in the game. That's kind of the main use. I have it for now for Ancient Strings. It has a lot of uses. Also, it can be used to find your Steelbolt Bowlers on your sideboard, because you can look. Basically, you have a lot of artifacts that are hate pieces sideboard, and Ancient Strings can allow you to find one of those and put it in your hand and cast it back after. Really strong card, but it has lost a bit of its lust when we lost Monk's Opal, because this used to allow us to find, for example, the Ravager or find the Ballista we need to win the game on turn 3. And we also had additional mana thanks to Monk's Opal. So now it's a card that you need to be more careful when you put it. That's it for the 1 mana drops. Oh no, we still have Vines of Asgard. This is a more recent addition to the deck done by... Actually, it He's one of the members of the Discord from Hardened Scales. He has a very hard to remember name with capital letters and H and S something. One of the better players of Hardened Scales in the Discord. Has a lot of cool foils. And yeah, this card is actually really good. This card is basically working in a way that it can protect our online attacks. So for example, you attack with Enigma, the opponent passes, you do one. Great. It can also target a creature with kicker, so you can pay 2 mana and give it +4/+4, meaning that Enigma Nexus will become a 5/5, basically ending the game if your opponent is a 5 poison. It can become +4/+4 into a attacking ballista that didn't block, a servo that didn't block, and on top of that, it can be used on your opponent's creatures to negate some of their, for example, if they're trying to equip a Colossus Hammer, or they're trying to cast the Mobile Rage on their own creature, you can cast as a That's Good, and then they cannot be targeted, so they lose that effect, right? Very, very strong card. I wouldn't play more than 1. I would play probably 0, 2, 1. More than 1 seems a bit excessive because it's still a card that's purely reactive in nature, so in some matchups it will not be so strong. The kicker does help. The kicker allows you to make it more of a proactive card, but it's still not a card you would like to play in many copies. Still powerful, and the single tone effect really, really strong. Then on to the 2-drops. We have a lot of 2-drops in the deck, even though it doesn't look like it now. Let's start with Iron Rodger, which is the all-star of the deck. Iron Ravager has 2 abilities, has modular 1, just like Arbon Worker, and that's why I say Worker is good, because Ravager has double the mana for the same amount of counters. Then it has this ability which is just so great. It says, sacrifice an artifact, so any artifact, and you put a 1/1 counter on Iron Ravager. And you guess it right. If you have Hardened Scales, instead of putting 1/1 counter, you're gonna have 2 1/1 counters. You have a 2/2. And more importantly, very importantly, Iron Ravager is able to sacrifice itself. So that means that, let's say you have a Ballista, a Ravager, and 20 servos. You can sacrifice the 20 servos, sack it to the Ravager, put 20 counters on the Ravager, sacrifice the Ravager to itself, put the counters with modular onto the Ballista, and kill your opponent. So this is kind of the main kill of the deck. It normally involves Iron Ravager. Iron Ravager is an exceptionally good card, and it's great in combination with a lot of the rest of the deck. For example, like basically the deck is built around Iron Ravager. If you have 2 Iron Ravagers, it is a crazy engine. And you have, let's say, something like 2 Iron Ravagers and Nozolith, you'll be surprised the amount of counters you can. So yeah, Iron Ravager basically also can be a lethal attacker sometimes, because you can attack, and if your opponent doesn't block, you sacrifice your board and you kill them. This has happened quite a lot to me. Basically forcing your opponent into awkward situations where they block when they shouldn't, or when they block when they don't want to, or they don't block and they lose, right? So this is really, really the glue of the deck. I mean, this is one of the better cards in the deck, and it's cool that Hardened Scales can still play Iron Ravager. It's kind of a vestige from the past, you know. Back in the day, Affinity was banned in Standard. So Iron Ravager was banned in Standard because it was just that good of a card, and it kind of lost a bit of its lust when, you know, Moxobo was banned and Affinity kind of disappeared. So it's cool to see that there's still a deck that can utilize it, and Hardened Scales is the deck. Hardened Scales is probably the best Iron Ravager deck that has ever been. Let's talk about the other 2-drops. Most importantly, Walking Ballista and Hangaba Walker. So Walking Ballista is XX creature, so it means that you need to pay same amount of mana twice to cast it, and for every value of X, it enters a battlefield with a 1/1 counter. If you pay 2 mana, is a 1/1. If you pay 4 mana, is a 2/2. You cannot pay 3 mana, you cannot pay 5 mana. Then it has a secondary ability. You can pay 4 mana to put an extra counter on it, and you can remove a counter from it and deal 1 damage to any target. And the beauty of this is that this can be, of course, done at instant speed, and this basically gives Ballista double strike. So if you have a 10-10 Ballista and you hit your opponent is basically dead. If it's a 20, because you deal 10 damage from the attack, and you ping to your opponent 10 times and you kill them, right? It's very good against Phantasmal Image, against Elves, against 1/1s. You know, like, this is basically one of the fastest skills, one of the most powerful cards we have versus creature decks, and one of the few cards that has reach in the deck. So your opponent, if your opponent is at 4, sometimes you can play in a way that they put the defenses down, you cast a Ballista, you sack your board to it, you put it to a Walking Ballista, and you win. And all of it can be done at instant speed. Oh, nice, all the removing. So it's great. It's probably one of the better cards of the deck. The card would probably, the deck would probably not exist if Walking Ballista was banned, but thankfully it's not. Not like mine. The other payoff of XX nature is Hangover Walker, maybe not as explosive as Walking Ballista, but much more resilient. When it dies, it creates Topters, which are 1/1 flyers, for every counter that it has. And it can actually pump itself, but pay 1 mana and tapping it, making it able to grow itself for a very low mana investment. And one of the alternative kills of the deck is to put 20 counters on a Hangover Walker, sacrifice it, and then you have 20 Topters and you just... So very, very powerful card, very, very... one of the better 2-drops to play in turn 2, especially if your opponent has interaction. And a 2-drop that can actually grow itself, which is really, really good. Don't underestimate this card. I mean, it's maybe not as flashy as Walking Ballista or Urban Ravager or Enigma of Nexus, but this card will win you a lot of games. It's probably one of the better cards in the deck. And, it's both an enabler for kills, but it's also an enabler for getting extra counters, because every counter you put on Hangover Walker will yield you an extra Topter that you can also sacrifice to Ravager or to whatever. Works extremely well with the Ozolith. Let's say you have a 10-10 Hangover Walker, you sacrifice it, you make 10 Topters, and you have 10 counters on the Ozolith that you can put on one of those Topters for kill. Overall, it's a fantastic card, and you should play it, like always. This is the best card in the grindy matchups, like Jaunt and Shadow and everything, because it's really hard for them to deal with both this card and then the Topters that will come after. Overall, fantastic. What else? Okay, we have more 2-drops here. Silverseer is a old school affinity card, really cool. I mean, this is not even the old school art, but whatever, old school edition, but whatever. Very simple card. You play it on turn. The best uses of this is when you play it on turn 2 on the play, and then you tap it. You put counters on all your creatures. It's not. It used to be maligned when Scales was with Mox Opal and it was more popular. Nowadays, I think anonymously people like this card because when you play in turn 2, you put your opponent in a situation where if they don't have removal, you can take over the game. And I think that's very strong nowadays in Modern. You need to play these threats that they are must answer threats. If you don't make your opponent answer stuff, they will overpower you by playing their own threats, right? And we're not that good at answering threats. We're much better at presenting threats. So we would rather opponent pass a Silverseer, get an extra land, or Fatal pushes it, and then them developing their own game plan a lot of the time. And if they don't do it, then it's a card that is just fantastic at just basically running away with the game, because then you play a Ballista, put an extra counter, works of scores with Hardened Scales, it works with the Ozolith, so because it still puts counters on itself, then you can sacrifice it and move the counters that it had to another creature. Basically, Ozolith gives modular to all your creatures. Overall, I think a perfect one-off. This is like the perfect definition of a one-off. Sometimes it's great, sometimes does nothing. But the times it's great probably outweigh the times it does nothing, so it's a perfect card to have as a one-off. You could play as a 2-off as well. If you want it to be more likely you want to play it on the... you will play this. And it could be a very good card to play versus like Path to Exile control decks and versus creature decks. For example, humans, if you start this turn 2 and your opponent has doesn't have answer, basically it's very rare to lose after that, because you can just make so many counters that you can put on your servos. Your animation model on Silverseer means that you can put counters on all your servos. It just gets out of control really fast. Another card that's very good is Metallic Mimic. Metallic Mimic has three main uses in the deck. The first use is to basically, it's a shapeshifter. You need to name a card name when you enter the battlefield, and a card type, and you name Construct normally. And when you name Construct, it allows you to play both Hangover Walker and Walking Ballista for X = 0, and they will come in with a 1/1 counter into a battlefield anyway, which is very nice. So it allows you to kind of farm into your hand. It also means that when you play a worker, it will come in with an extra counter, and when you play Scavenger Commander, it will also come in with an extra counter. And the same if you cast a Walking Ballista for X = 1, it won't come in as an extra counter. So it works as a pseudo Hardened Scales for some of the deck. Of course, it doesn't work when you move the counters around, but it can allow you to establish a board presence early in the game, and that is the main use of it. The second use of Metallic Mimic is to name Servo. And why? Because every time you pay 1 and you have an animation model and you make a Servo, and you have Metallic Mimic in play naming Servo, then that Servo will enter with a +1/+1 counter on, which in the time will trigger animation model again, allowing you to make another Servo, which in time will trigger animation model again, allowing you to make as many servos as you have mana to to use, right? So this is a really, really powerful interaction. Doesn't come up a ton, but when it does come up, it wins the game on its own. The third usage of this is to put it in top tier. So you have a very big Hangable Walker, you can play Metallic Mimic, top tier, sacrifice a Hangable Walker, and all the top tiers that come into the battlefield, they will be coming in with an extra counter on, which will finish the game extremely. Overall, pretty cool card. Has fallen a bit out of fashion in the modern times because it's sometimes hard to justify spending 2 mana on what is basically Nano Elves for the deck. So I would be a bit wary about this. It's very good versus combo decks, it's very good versus strong decks, so if there's a lot of those in your meta, this is a good card, but it's not very good against control decks, because when you cast a Walking Ballista for x=0, your opponent passes 2x on the Metallic Mimic when the Ballista is on the stack, you lose the Ballista, right? Because the Ballista, when it enters the battlefield, it doesn't see the Mimic anymore, and it's a 0/0 and it dies. So it can be easily 2 for 1, and if you get 2 for 1 in that fashion, it's almost impossible to recover, I guess, versus a control. Another card that's a 2-drop, and I guess more important, is a Throne of Geth. Throne of Geth is kind of a card that is made for this deck. It's a 2-drop, so it's extremely good. Go on turn 2 versus open mana that your opponent is holding up, for example, Final Push. It allows you to sacrifice any artifact by tapping it, and then you can proliferate. And what does proliferate mean is you can put an extra counter to whoever already has a counter. You have a +1/+1 counter on your creatures, and you can give it an extra +1/+1 counter. If your opponent has poison counters, yes, you can proliferate your poison counter. If your opponent has creatures that have -1/-1 counters, you can proliferate those as well. So overall, really great card. And it also has a sacrifice outlet. So you know, it allows you to sacrifice your workers, sacrifice your Hangable Walkers, sacrifice your Scrapbearer Combiners, basically even sacrifice itself to generate more counters, and it allows you to just kill your own creatures in order to get value from them. Really strong card, and it's great to play at least 2, normally sometimes 1, sometimes 3, but I think 2 is kind of a sweet spot where you don't really want 2. It's the same kind of situation as an emission model, like 2 or Throne of Geth maybe a bit too much sometimes. You don't really want 2, but you do want to see the 3% of the game. Then what else do we have here? Spellskite. This card comes in and out. Basically pretty old school, also Infinity card. It's really strong when Bolt is it's very popular because it allows you to redirect it to the Spellskite, making it survive. It's very good against Boggles, very good against a lot of the other decks. It's not great against Path to Exile or against something like Cryptic Command. And sometimes it's not a threat in its own, so to lose a bit of its lost. I tend to bring in Spellskite from time to time when there's a lot of bolts. And it's also pretty good blocker, being at 0/4. But it's not a game-ending card. And I think nowadays you're better off sometimes just playing your own threats instead of playing cards that protect your creatures. But it's still a card you can consider, and if you like it, or you spec a lot of Boggles, or you spec a lot of Infect, for example, this can redirect like some of the spells that Infect uses, like Blinds or Fastgroot. So in general, I really like this card. It's really good in the mirror because you can redirect the modular trigger. That's terrible. Or you, if you are in the mirror and open Spellskite. But yeah, Spellskite is one of the better cards in the game for the mirror. It costs life, so you also have to be careful of that. Versus an aggressive deck, this 2 life you need to pay may actually end up hurting you. And overall, yeah, it's kind of a medium card. You can play it if you want to, and I think as a one-off is the sweet spot. I wouldn't never play more than Spellskite, I think. I think from 0 to 1 is just very good. Especially as this plays in the Lurus fields, because a lot, you know, if you have Welding Jar, Spellskite, and Lurus, basically that means that you can keep bringing back the Welding Jar to protect the Spellskite, and there's nothing they can do to deal with the Lurus. But in the end, yeah, that's a kind of a neat. Finally, a card that's seen some play. I don't love it particularly. I tried it and I'm not 100% on it. It's a Scripture of Abundance. You pay 2 mana, and you can either put 2 counters on a creature, you can gain life, where life is equal to the greatest power among creatures your opponent controls, or you control, so it depends on who you're targeting. And then you can also fight. It's also a fight spell that you can fight. One of your creatures can fight your opponent's creatures. And basically, I think Pandanaconda from Discord here is the best. Like, in the white-green version, we're not playing Dromoka's Command, and Dromoka's Command is a better card than this, because you can always use two modes. And even though Dromoka's Command only puts 1 counter on it, it's already like not seeing any play at all. the main draw of this card is the kicker ability. So it allows you to use 5 mana to put the counters, gain the life, and fight an opponent creature, which can be kind of backbreaking in the creature matches, but those matches are already pretty good. So I don't see what problem does this card try to solve. I don't think it's not a card I love particularly. You should definitely have this in the main board. Don't put it in the sideboard because this card is like generally not okay. It's not great, but it's okay. And in your sideboard, you want cards that are not okay. You want cards that are great at the specific things, right? So I would rather play this in the main deck as a way to fight aggressive decks, to fight creature decks, to get those extra counters for a fast kill versus a control deck. But it's not amazing in any of the situations, so you might as well bring in something that's amazing instead of an institutional. That's my part. Then finally, the 3-drops. There's basically only 2 3-drops that really see play in Hardened Scales. First one is a Modern Horizons way of trying to help Hardened Scales. So instead of, they took away the Mox Opal, but they gave us Scavenger Combiner once, I think. Scavenger Combiner has Modular 2, which is really cool. So basically it comes in with 2 counters and it moves 2 counters, but it costs 3 mana. So you can see the comparison to Worker is very bad. This gives you 2 counters for 3 mana, Worker gives you 1 counter for 1 mana. Much better rate than that card. But it has a secondary ability that comes up quite a lot, that you can tap it and sacrifice an artifact, becoming a pseudo Stone of Gatsby that allows you to sacrifice an artifact to get the effects that it has. And you can search a library for a construct card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. So what are constructs? Everything in this deck is a construct. So Walking Ballista, Hangabag Walker, Arvan Worker, Steel Overseer is a construct. Scavenger Combiner a construct, but Arvan Ravager is not a construct. So I think here they chickened out. They were like, oh, maybe it will be too strong. You would say sacrifice an artifact, search library for an artifact. That would have been the best. But it does not do that. It just looks for a construct. Normally Walking Ballista or Hangabag Walker. So pretty stomp. It's a very powerful effect because it allows you to tutor probably one of the better cards in your deck. So in a way, it works a little bit like an Ancient Strings in that sense. And it's something you can sacrifice to generate a lot of counters. So this card is very powerful if it goes unanswered, and not the greatest if it gets answered, because spending 3 mana to something that dies to Vault is kind of bad. But still, you get the counters from it, so it's not like everything is. I used to hate the card, and recently I've been kind of loving it. So I don't know where I will be in a couple of months, but if you're watching this, I would recommend you learn this card. You learn how it works. You learn that it's actually an ability, so you can activate your opponent's turn. You can actually sacrifice itself to move the counters and find the dude. Overall, it's a pretty strong card when it untaps. I mean, it's not amazing, but it's kind of, like it has this function of maybe being, for me, the main goal of this card is that it's Worker number 5 and 6, so it has you have more density of creatures that have counters on them, so you can move them around. And if opponent doesn't answer it, then you can actually tutor for something that's wrong. Still, we have a easy time using our mana and scales, so sometimes this tutor makes it so we actually have to sacrifice a creature or an artifact, and then spend some of the mana that we could spend on something else on that ballista, which could be marginally better than what we were gonna do, but it's not extremely much better than what we're gonna do. Of course, when you have nothing to do, Scavenger Combiner. And a card that's kind of a pet card of mine. I played it for a long time until Lightning Bolt became very popular. I love this card, Crystalline Giant, when we had when there was what's it called, the Snow Control era with Arcum's Astrolabe, because Lightning Bolt was not seeing any play back then, because those decks were really strong versus Lightning Bolt decks. So, and on top of that, Scourge's Skyclave had not been printed, and yeah, the only answer was Path to Exile. So this card does is at the beginning of your combat, you randomly choose a counter, and you put it to Crystalline Giant. This counters can be Flying, First Strike, Death Touch, Hexproof, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, Vigilance, and +1/+1. So if it already has a +1/+1, you will not get that. And what happens is that if this card dies, the skill counters come into the Ozolith. So for example, if you get a Hexproof counter and the Crystalline Giant dies, then the Hexproof counter will go into Ozolith, which will make it a Hexproof creature. And yeah, and from there basically you can move to another creature to make it Hexproof, give it lifelink. So this allows for some crazy turns, even though random. Like you could give Death Touch or Walking Ballista, just kill all your opponent's creatures. You can give lifelink to a Walking Ballista, you gain life to ping your opponent. You can give hexproof to Enigma Nexus, etc. Right? So this card was really, really good because what I like a lot about this card is that they require non-investment. Unlike a Scavenger Combiner, where it requires you to tap it, sacrifice it, whatever, this card just allows you that you cast it and you let it do its thing. If your opponent doesn't respect it, 3 or 4 turns later, he's standing down at a 5/5 life linker, trampler, vigilance, hexproof creature that can end the game pretty fast, and you don't need to do anything with it. You don't need to tap it. You can attack, you can block. You know, you don't need to spend any other resource. So I really like this card, and I hope that there is a time. You know, I'm pretty sure Lightning Bolt will eventually wane from the format when all these Scorch decks, if one day they lose popularity, then it's a good time on a sideboard. These are more or less all I could think about. I'm sure there's other cards that are good, but I think these are the cards that I've used in my last decks I'm looking, and must be something else. I think this has been quite the comprehensive list. So the first kind of artifacts you have is Graveyard Hate, and those ones will be these 4 lights here. So let's go in order. Right? Tormod's Crypt is like probably one of the weakest Graveyard Hates, right? Exiles your opponent's graveyard for 0 mana. So this card only really sees play when you're facing against some extremely fast deck like Hoga, or when you are facing yeah, basically, because it doesn't replace itself, you're -1 card down, so you don't want to use this against Udo decks. You don't want to use this against other kinds of decks. Yeah, it's an okay card, but it doesn't see a ton of play in Scales just because it costs you 1 mana. It costs you 1 card and it costs you no mana. It's much better to spend maybe 1 or 2 mana and either shut down your opponent's graveyard completely, or draw a card when you are cycling, right? So this card is only good against like Dredge, Vengevine, and against like Hogak style decks, you know, like decks that just will put, like, it's good also against Upsol spells, like also decks that will just put all their deck in the graveyard as soon as possible and try to kill you right there and then it doesn't matter if you draw a card or not. It's just one thing is to other graveyard, right? So if you see a lot of Dredge, maybe Tormod's Crypt is okay, but I would say that probably the better card in this situation is the Grafdigger's Cage. Grafdigger's Cage basically prevents spells to be cast from graveyard, so no conflagrates, and the creature cards cannot enter the battlefield from graveyards or libraries. So it also works versus Collected Company style decks. It works versus Evolution, Eldritch Evolution, Sort of Calling, all those cards. This is top, so it's really quite strong. It works against Udo as well, but it's the same reason Stormbolt Crypt is not very good against Udo. It doesn't replace itself. But overall, like, this is the strongest Graveyard Hate available. So you're playing, there's a lot of Dredge, there's a lot of heavy graveyard decks where you're like center basically on the graveyard or on getting cards from their deck. Like Neoform, then Grafdigger's Cage is the best tool available. There was a while where we played 4 Grafdigger's Cage in the sideboard when Dredge was extremely popular, but mostly has been replaced by Relic Opportunities because it allows you to exile their cards, so it's good also against Tarmogoyfs, it's good against 1 and 6, and it replaces itself, which is very, very important. Speaking of Relic Opportunities, this card just sees a ton of plays. It's really, really good. Like, the activated ability, you should always activate it as soon as you can, because you don't want to give your opponent choices. Like, let's say your opponent has a land in there and you don't want to really exile a land, but if for some reason your opponent is playing a surprise and 6 you didn't stop, and then they just, for example, you say they play an opt, and now they have opt and land, and then you activate it and they exile the opt, then you have given them the chance to get that line back in their hand somehow. So now you give them the chance, exile as soon as you can. You can also exile the cards from your own graveyard, so it's good versus Surgical Extraction. It's good versus Surgical Extraction, one that comes up a lot. It comes up versus like Tarmogoyfs. You can exile, for example, if you have an enchantment in the graveyard that's growing your opponent's Tarmogoyfs, you can exile that. And it also can replace itself. Like, so for 1 mana, you need to tap it. You can exile the Relic Opportunities and exile all the cards in both graveyards. So you can do it for, like, if there's a big turn coming up with from Dredge or something, or you can do it to reduce the size of the opponent's graveyard when they have, like, for example, 2 Uros there, or when they're gonna get something back with Mystic Sanctuary. Really, overall, very strong card. Very good to reduce sizes of graveyard, which are pretty important versus escape cards like Uro or Kroxa. Yeah, overall, just is a fantastic card. This is my graveyard hate of choice recently. I played 2 to 3 relics on most of my decks because the fact that they are replacing themselves really makes a massive difference to Gravity Scales. You just really don't want to be one card down, and exiling the card solves the problem forever. So let's say your opponent has 6 cards in the graveyard, one of them Uro and has 5 others, and you play the relic and you exile the graveyard. That Uro is gone. But if you play Gravity Scales, they can, for example, bounce it with the Fairy Unraveler and then cast the Uro, and then all the you basically spend this card the whole game. They did nothing the whole game, and then when it could do something, it was bounced or it was destroyed. This relic completely ends, exiles all those creatures, and basically means that there is no way they can cast ever again, which is really important. And a similar card to Relic Opportunity is the much more newer Soul-Guide Lantern. Soul-Guide Lantern cannot be used to reduce the size of graveyard, so I don't like it so much in that sense. But it can exile somebody's graveyard, your opponent's graveyard, without having to pay any mana. So it is very strong. This card is stronger versus decks like Dredge, because it means that for 1 mana you can exile your opponent's graveyard, even though you don't get the card back. Or you can pay 1 mana and draw a card, but you can do both, right? So in a way, Soul-Guide Lantern most of the time will play down on cards. You can use it to exile, for example, an Uro, and just have it laying around. And if one time you need a card, you can cycle it. But in general, I prefer Relic Opportunities right now. Yeah, so these are the kind of graveyard hate cards. And then we have I would call them the green cards, which is the green sideboard cards that we have. And the most basic one is Nature's Claim. This used to be a staple in the deck, has been since substituted. The Nature's Claim is your artifact / enchantment destruction spell of choice. It's very good against Stony Silence, against Ether Vials, against the Mirror, against Ensnaring Breach. It's not very good versus Chalice of the Void. And in general, it's it's very good versus Burn, because you can destroy your own creatures to gain 5. But it has a problem that it has 1 mana cost, and it gives life to your opponent, so puts them maybe out of reach. But in general, it's very good, and it's pretty bad against Chalice of the Void. So this card, you want it in matchups where, for example, you're playing against Stormforge Mystic, you're playing against Stony Silence effects, like Stony Silence, the card itself. You're playing versus Rest in Peace kind of cards. Then Nature's Claim is good. Sometimes other, Nature's Claim is not so good. So that's why it was being recently substituted by Gembrazer. Gembrazer is a new card from Ikoria. I read it and I never thought about it, and then I saw it in somebody's list, and it just makes a lot of sense. You can mutate. And mutating, what does that mean? You pay general, a colorless and 2 green, and you can put this card on top or on bottom of one of your creatures you control. And when you do this, Gembrazer you can destroy a target artifact or enchantment your opponent controls, so it does a disenchant effect. But on top of that, you put the Gembrazer on top normally, and then if the creature in the bottom has counters, Gembrazer will also have the counters. Or if it has abilities, Gembrazer will also have the abilities. For example, you put it on top of a Ballista that is a 2/2, then you will end up with a 6/6 trample reach creature that you can remove 2 counters from, and it's not an artifact at that point, so it can be activated through Stony Silence and to deal 2 damage. Right? So it's a really, really powerful card, and really good versus Lightning Bolt decks as well, because it's hard for opponents to deal with them. It's good against Blood Moon decks, really good against Chalice of the Void, Counter Great Creator. In general, this turned, the Counter Great Creator matches were close, but Gembrazer has made them much better for us than they were once were, because there's no way they can log you out with Chalice on 1 for the Nature's Claim, Ensnaring Breach for your attacks, and a Counter Great Creator for your abilities. They can't do that anymore. Really, really strong card. And on top of that, if you have a Gembrazer in the battlefield and you mutate on top of the same Gembrazer, the ability triggers twice, because mutate means that it's both when the card mutates on something, or when something mutates on something, right? So if you have 2 Gembrazers, you can trigger the Gembrazer twice for 2 destruction spells, and which can be game winning and all. And then you have Veil of Summer, which is very similar, very different to the other cards. Veil of Summer is a protection spell, which basically against counter spells is a cryptic command, because it stops your cards from being countered for the rest of the game, or the rest of the turn. So the subsequent cards you play, they are also uncounterable, and makes your permanents have protection versus fast hexproof from blue and black. And on top of that, it draws a card. This card is just fantastic versus blue control decks that try to have a lot of counter spells, and versus black decks that try to remove creatures with Fatal Push and everything. Like, if people do something like spend 2 mana on Assassin's Trophy and you end up with a Veil of, and you respond to that with a Veil of Summer drawing a card, so backbreaking, you know, you basically got a head on cards and your opponent and a head on mana in one single card. It's just fantastic, fantastic card. A lot of people claim for this to be banned. I don't think so, because if counter spells decks are at the top of the format now, imagine if Veil of Summer was banned. But also it's true the Veil of Summer is used by the same blue decks to protect their own counter spells to other people's counter spells. So overall, a messed up card, and since it's a messed up card, you should play it. Then utility artifacts, you have Pithing Needle. Pithing Needle, I've been playing it more and more recently. It can stop any activated ability, so it can be Expedition Map, it can be Ren 6, the Fairy Time Rattler, it can be Goblin Char Belcher. It basically uses an out to cards combo decks that we normally don't have an out to. It's very good against a Hammer Time deck because you can name Emo Nexus, you can name Colossus Hammer and stop it if you don't have Cicada's 8. Overall, a very powerful card that it has a variety of uses, and I mean, I think maybe you don't need to. Maybe one is fine in your deck, but I would say that you want to be playing in an open match metagame. It's probably worse, but in a metagame where you know there are some cards, some decks that Pithing Needle completely wrecks, it's pretty good. It's also an alternative to Damping Sphere in my experience. So Damping Sphere is normally brought in versus combo decks and Tron decks. And Pithing Needle can do that and also be useful in other matchups. So it's a card that I've been enjoying quite a lot and I've been playing quite a lot of. And doing a lot of winning because of it too. Like it can stop Ether Vials, it can stop like Mutavaults. I mean, I've used it for a lot of variety of matchups. It's not very good in like grindy matchups because still like grindy matchups as in Jaunt. It's still a card you use to get rid of a card that your opponent maybe doesn't have. But it can stop fetch lands. Jaunt is strongest versus decks that depend on one card to win the game. For example, the Yakmoth deck. If you put Pithing Needle on Yakmoth, they have until they find an answer to the Pithing Needle, they cannot kill you, right? Devoted Devastation decks. If you put the Pithing Needle on Devoted Druid, they cannot untap it. Yeah, basically these kinds of decks, this is what is the strongest at. So it helps us in the combo matchups, which is some of the hardest matchups. Not a Nasium though, it doesn't really do much against a Nasium. So overall, it's a solid card. I would say if you have the slots, you don't know what to put it. Let's say you have 14 cards in your sideboard and you don't know where else to put. A Pithing Needle can never hurt. Atmigsphere is another kind of solution to combo decks. Atmigsphere makes it so any mana that would land that would tap for more than 1 mana only taps for 1 mana. So it's good against Amulet Titan. It's good versus Tron. And also makes it so every spell that you cast after the first spell, it costs 1 extra mana to cast, right? So it kind of makes it a sort of the Phoenix Silence kind of card. But the bad thing is it also affects you, right? So you cannot cast 2 spells a turn, and this is something that Skills does a lot of, because all our cards are so cheap. So it's sometimes this card is good, but it has a real downside in that it really slows ourselves down as well. But it's really good versus combo decks, and yeah, you get these big mana decks. I've been cutting Damping Spheres from my sideboards recently just because I found that I can beat Tron without it, and Amulet Titan, a lot of times they could play around it. They were not so dependent. Like probably this would give me 1 turn Damping Sphere, 1 or 2 turns, but it will also cost me 1 turn to cast it, and it will also slow me down, right? So in the end, it will be kind of the ending was the same. So in general, I've been moving away from Damping Spheres, but it's really good like against Nasium decks and against any deck that Storm decks try to cast a million cards. In fact, like my current sideboard is very weak to Storm, and I think Storm is kind of making a comeback, right? So yeah, in versus Storm, you do want Damping Sphere or something. Then the last card of this kind of category, I would say, is Torpor Orb. Torpor Orb, it's extremely strong. I would play around 1 to 2. I think I wouldn't play more than 2, but I've been playing a lot of 2, and I've been always impressed with the card. Doesn't come in very many matchups, but the matchups it does come in, it kind of wins the game on its own. So it's good against humans, goblins, Cycle Evaporation decks, even Titan decks, because it stops the Titan trigger and enter the battlefield, which is really strong. So basically, and against Amulet Titan, it allows it, like if they go Titan with an Amulet, they normally can haste the Titan and find 2 extra lands. In this case, they will not get those lands, so they need to wait a whole turn cycle to attack again, which makes them actually, like, it can gain you a couple of turns at the top row. Stops also Skyclave Apparition, stops any kind of Soul Herder shenanigan, Icewind Coral, but the downside of this card, it doesn't stop Uro. In fact, it does stop Uro, but it also stops the bad part about the Uro, which is the one that makes it sacrifice, right? So if they play an Uro and you have a Torpor Rope, they will just have a 6/6 for 3 mana, which is, other than that, a really, really solid card, and I wouldn't leave my home with less than one of it. It's just that good. Then Dismember is kind of a class on its own in the mono green version. It's kind of the only removal spell that we can really play. I guess you could play Ratchet Bomb, and you know, most of the splashes play bear removal. They play Lightning Bolt, Path to Exile, Fatal Push. But in the mono green version, Dismember it is. Dismember is actually one of the most white removal spells, right? Because it can hit your own creatures if you need to sacrifice something in a pinch. It can kill almost any creature in Modern, so you can kill like Dryad of the Elysian Grove, you can kill Monster Suspiel, Soulscar Mage, it can kill most of the threats in Magic, in Modern Magic, you can kill with Dismember. It can make a creature smaller, like a Titan, to a 1/1, so you can block it for like with a Servo, for example, or something like that. And it only costs only 1 mana, which is very important. You could play also Special Contortion, but Special Contortion costing 2 mana is a deal breaker. It costs you 4 life, but since you have a mostly painless mana base, it's generally pretty good. Yeah, in general, very, very good card to deal with a ton of a lot of the problem creatures in Modern, and it only costs 1 mana. I'm playing currently 4 because it's one of the better cards against the Titan decks, also against Storm decks. It's very good against Omnath decks. Against anybody that wants to play creatures versus you, Dismember is very good. It's extremely good versus Collector Oof, which is a card that it doesn't see a ton of play, but it's, you know, basically Stony Silence on a stick. You want to make sure you have the answer for that. Basically, playing 4 means that you have more chances of drawing it, and I mean, even though sometimes you will actually lose a lot of life from it, sometimes you just need to have just remove these 1/2 key creatures for 1 mana to just pave the way for victory, right? So really recommend playing at least 3, if not 4, Dismembers in your deck. And finally, Karn Sign of Forces. The card has fallen a bit of favor for various reasons. One of them is Omnath. Omnath just kind of does a Wrath on Planeswalkers every turn, so it kind of kills Karn very, very fast. But it's really one of the better grindy cards that we have that is very different than the other cards, right? So it attacks from a completely different angle. Karn Sign of Forces draws cards, even though it does it in an awkward manner. It has a ton of loyalty, so it's very hard to attack it down. And it can also make the 0/0 construct artifacts that Urza makes, which will basically cannot end the game on their own. So you play Karn, you minus it, and you can minus it twice before you need to plus it. So, and these 2 Karn constructs, they can really turn the tails in some matchups. I really like to plus the Karn, even though you get the worst of the 2 cards, it's still pretty good. And you can always minus if you get an extremely good card exiled. So it allows you to, you know, like, put it so far out of reach. Like, if you plus Karn, then opponent needs 2 bolts to deal with it. So it's just fantastic. I used to play this card a lot versus in the Snow era, like the Snow Archon Desolate decks, because it allowed you, basically, we're really bad at attacking down Planeswalkers. So, and then it allowed you to just basically run away with the game because you got so much advantage. And, you know, the Karn advantage is separate from the rest of the deck, you know, it's not synergistic in a way. So Karn can generate advantage, but you still do your stuff, and they need to deal with Karn and your stuff. And at that point, it's very easy to win the game. So the Karn is really good when matchups are grinding, and it's good when opponents have a hard time attacking down Karns, or like Planeswalkers in general. Like it was that time where a lot of for example, it's also pretty good against Eldrazi because you can generally block their creatures. And it's pretty good against the Reto Bosch Prowess deck because they never really want to trade down on cards, that deck, right? They don't want to use 2 Lightning Bolts to kill Karn. And sometimes they cannot really attack it, so and then you can make constructs to block. So in general, a good card versus decks that are not good at attacking down Planeswalkers. And I really like in this kind of grindy matches because, as I said, it's an independent engine compared to the let's say, other normal grindy cards. Like Animation Model constantly needs mana to be invested on Karn. You just play it once and you can just keep getting the value and forcing your opponent to. Alright guys, this is the video. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope I've been clear enough. I tried to talk about every single card of the of the game, I'll try to put like timestamps where I'm saying like, okay, this is the land, this is the 1-drops, etc. And looking forward to the next parts coming up, maybe probably next year, but I will try to make it as a semi-regular thing. To finish up, this is my current deck list, or the deck list I will play in the next stream I make. I used to play 2 Pithing Needles and 2 Torpor Herbs, but I've been leaning more towards having a bit more graveyard hate. I have 3 Relics of Progenitus and 1 Surgical Extraction to combat the Upsal Spells decks, and also this can be decent against some Uro decks that rely heavily on graveyard. I've been meaning to put one of them in my sideboard to see how that works. Only 1 Pithing Needle, 1 Torpor Herb, so our draw matchup does get worse by having only 1 Pithing Needle, but I think it's okay. And oftentimes you don't want to draw 2 Pithing Needles, right? So that's okay. Same with Torpor Herb, you never want to draw 2. We still have Ancient Stirrings, and the matches where this is good, I haven't seen as many of recently, but maybe it will be needed to bring in a second, maybe for this Surgical Extraction. If Titan becomes very popular, Cycle becomes very popular. For these members, very strong, and 3 Gem Razors also. I think this is mainstay at this moment. At least this, I won't leave my place. So these 8 cards on the sideboard, 10 cards on the sideboard on the right side. I wouldn't leave my home without, you know, this is the strongest for what you need. You need some removal, you need some Artifact Hate, you need Dale, and Relic of Progenitus, at least you need 2, I would say. The rest is kind of depending on what matchups you. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and I'll see you in the next one.